I'll be back in just a minute from here in Havana on this special edition of BBC World News America. And what we're going to show you is a unique slice of life courtesy of the Dixon family. It tells you an awful lot about the past, the present and the future of this country. It was yesterday, 2 years ago, that Raúl Castro took over the reins of power officially as the president of Cuba. Now, his older brother Fidel, the man who created modern Cuba, is of course still with us, both in body and in spirit, although rather ailing. However, just today the Cuban government released some pictures of Fidel Castro. He was in extremely good form. Apparently he had met with the Brazilian President Lula da Silva, who's here on a visit, and President Lula described him as exceedingly well. Now, for more than half a century, Fidel Castro was the defining voice of this country. He was the personification, the embodiment of everything that it meant to be Cuban, at least on a political level. And so we really wanted to find out what life is like here in Cuba today under the Castros, both Fidel and Raúl, and how it might develop in the future. Here's our look. From above, Havana is a warren of statistics about economic decline or the effect of the American embargo. But what's life really like down there? We spent a day with the Dixons on Dominguez Street. It's just before 7 and Lisette is getting her daughter Shaula ready for school. They're lucky because they have a view of the sea. They're less lucky because of all the twitchy policemen milling around their block. I'll explain that one later. She's very picky about her school lunch, Lisette complains. Breakfast is a rushed affair familiar to all families. The men have already left for work, and there is clearly some money here. A new South Korean fridge, a Chinese-made stereo, and all that porcelain. The Dixons have lived here for half a century thanks to the revolution. They pay virtually no rent, but nor does anyone repair their windows. Off to school on a short walk that feels like an excursion into Cuban history. The ancient car that's too clapped out even for Cuban use. It's been parked here for 10 years. The daily queue outside the fortress that passes for America's embassy, hence all the policemen. Most of these people want to leave Cuba, but Lisette, who's never been off the island, says that she only dreams of going to Brazil. The local school is free, of course, but also hard work. Classes till 4 and 2 hours of homework. Lisette is off to her job as an accountant in the state power company. Salary about £12 a month. Meanwhile, Ruben, her husband, is well up a pole and well into his shift as an electrical repairman for the very same company. He earns almost twice as much, but together it's barely enough to scrape by on. Cigarros. Which is why Auntie Hilda, in charge of the shopping, can't do without the government-issued ration cards. They're used for staples like bread and rice. Luxuries like fruit and vegetables she gets at the market, which sells things produced privately for profit by local farmers. This has been the biggest change in recent years. It costs more, she told us, but it tastes better. Back at home, Grandpa Israel gets his monthly health visit courtesy of the state. It's free, and the doctor comes to him. After a quick checkup, there's the usual lecture about diet and smoking. Dinner time. On the menu, fried pork and those vegetables from the market, as well as a passionate conversation about the David and Goliath relationship with America, another staple here. When Obama was elected, Hilda told us, we thought that things would change. A black man in the White House who made promises about Cuba. But nothing has changed. So what about their freedom, their human rights? I asked. They swallowed. The Dixons are living the strange contradictions of Cuban life. A cocktail of frustration, reassurance, pride and defiance. Soured by fear, trapped by history, and surrounded by water. Truly an island unto itself. So what about the broader political climate in this country, the cultural climate? Well, here to discuss that is Rafael Hernandez. He's the editor of Temas magazine. Thanks very much for coming onto the program. Rafael, tell me, Raul Castro, when he got into power yesterday, 2 years ago, as we said, promised change. He promised reform. How much of that have you actually seen?
Well, I think that it is part of the current situation in Cuba. We are in the middle of the transition from a kind of socialism to a different kind of socialism. And he's been able to carry on a lot of changes already. He has made a much more big state to shrink the state, the Cuban state. A few ministers have been merged. He's been able to transfer more land to peasants, to cooperativists, and he's trying to reorder the economic system. Reorder the economic system in Cuba is not easy. I think that he's in the middle of that, and that Cubans are demanding more and more, but the fact is that he has accomplished already important task, as the one I mentioned.
Exactly. I mean, when you talk to ordinary Cubans, certainly in private, they will say that they're very frustrated by the pace of change. Do they have a point?
Well, I think that the Cubans are always frustrated because we were used to have more. The standard of living we had in the 80s is not anymore the standard of living we have today. So until we have salaries and free market prices matching, all Cubans are going to be not very satisfied.
What about genuine political reform? I mean, you see small signs of it here and there in the party newspaper Grama, the reflexiones, reflections that are posted. They show that there's a bit of debate. But is there really genuine debate, political debate happening in the upper echelons of society here?
I think that Havana and Cuba, and we are in the middle of Havana, Havana is cooler than expected. I think that Havana is always more diverse, more heterogeneous, less unanimous than expected. And today, that disagreement is welcome. Many things that were prohibited or taboo 10 years ago, today are part of the public debate. And I would say that that is related to freedom of expression. Freedom of expression is an important area of political change.
But in one word, do you think that Cuba with Castro in charge, Raul Castro, can really be different?
It is different already. The Cuban society, which is never in the picture when political analysts talk about Cuba from abroad, the Cuban society is a different one. It's much more heterogeneous, and it is much more dynamic. We are discussing hyper-centralization. The key question, the key issue in Cuban politics today, in the public debate and in the decision-making politics, are exactly around decentralization.
Hyper-centralization, there's a new term. Rafael Hernandez, thank you very much for coming in.
You're welcome.
Well, after the break, we're going to tell you about a story that you probably won't have heard of, but that everyone here in Cuba cares deeply about and knows just about every detail of. I'm talking about the case of the so-called Cuban Five. The very fact that we're here is a sign that this government, this country, is trying to open more to the outside world. But just this week, there was also a reminder of the ugly side of Cuba. I'm talking about the death of a 42-year-old man in custody after 85 days of a hunger strike. His name is Arnaldo Zapata. He was jailed in 2003. The Cuban government described him as a common criminal in the pay of the Americans. Amnesty International has described him as a political prisoner. Now, in an unprecedented statement, President Raul Castro expressed his regret for the death of Mr. Zapata. An interesting development. But at the same time, they're not making too many excuses here. Now, there is, however, a rather fascinating reversal of this narrative of human rights abuses, which the Americans normally lay at the door of the Cubans, and that is the case of the Cuban Five. 5 Cubans arrested in America on conspiracy of espionage charges. It is a very interesting story. Watch. Their faces are everywhere, and everyone in Cuba knows their story.
Delante el desfile, compañeros.
Importantísimo para mí, para el pueblo de Cuba, porque
¿Por qué?
son 5 luchadores antiterroristas.
Okay, so he says the case of the Cuban Five, for him personally, he's a security guard, by the way, is incredibly important because it just sums up Cuba's struggle against the United States.
El problema es que los americanos, yo digo que en política hacia Cuba son irracionales.
This is
Mi opinión muy particular, lógicamente.
it's a problem of logic, he says. The fact that these 5 have been imprisoned in the US, like so much else, is an indication of how illogical, how irrational America is towards Cuba. So who are the Cuban 5, and why are they national heroes in Havana, yet virtually unknown in America, where they've been locked up for more than a decade? Bear with me, this is a complex story, but it's also a very important one, because it goes such a long way to explaining the septic nature of the relationship between Cuba and the United States. For its part, the US Supreme Court has now definitively decided not to hear the case of the Cuban 5. For their part, here in Havana, the government continues to lobby for their release, has hailed them as political prisoners, holds them up as the epitome of American hypocrisy, and perhaps most importantly of all, uses them to rally the masses.
Socialismo o muerte, patria muerte, venceremos.
The 5 were arrested in Florida in 1998 after infiltrating anti-Castro Cuban exile groups. One also worked at a US naval base. They spent 17 months in solitary confinement before being convicted, not of spying, but of conspiracy to spy against the United States. Critics say it was impossible for them to have a fair trial in Miami, the heart of the Cuban-American community. They also point out that the 5 were counter-terrorism agents.
They, in the Cuban mind, have been unjustly treated and unjustly imprisoned in the United States. For Cuba doing the same thing that the United States is doing all over the world, trying to protect the sanctity of its borders from terrorist attacks.
A year before their arrest, Cuba blamed US-based exile groups for a series of bombings which targeted hotels in Havana. Mr. Gonzalez, how would you describe your activities on behalf of the Cuban government? One of the 5, René Gonzalez, told me from his prison cell that he's still proud of his undercover work. We spoke on the phone, but the US jail refused to let us film him or even broadcast his voice.
It is unfair to keep someone in prison for fighting terrorism. I have been informing my government on terrorist activities, and all of a sudden I found myself facing a 15-year sentence. It would be crazy if it wasn't so politically charged.
René has not seen his wife Olga for 8 years. She was deported from Miami back to Cuba and has since been denied a visa 8 times because of her links to Cuban intelligence.
We had hopes with Obama at the beginning, but not any longer. Yes, he has the power to resolve these things, but he doesn't have the desire. He won't act unless there's a massive international outcry.
Cuba, however, doesn't have a monopoly on victims or indeed on anger.
These are the photographs of the 4 men that were shot down by Cuban MiGs over the international waters of the Florida Strait.
In 1996, 2 planes operated by the US-based exile group Brothers to the Rescue were shot down by the Cuban Air Force. Maggie Cooley's brother was on board one of them.
American citizen on board, engaged in a humanitarian mission.
Maggie's own daughter directed this documentary about the shooting down. The incident provoked a US crackdown on Cuban agents and ultimately led to the arrest of the 5. One of them was convicted of conspiracy to murder for passing on details about the group's flights to the Cuban government. This week marks the anniversary of the deaths, and Maggie is still angered by Cuban claims of American injustice.
I saw all 5 men get a very fair trial. I saw 3 of them get their sentences reduced. What I find really hard is to find many people who know very little about the case, just take Cuba's word for it and decide that these men are innocent, that these men weren't spies, that these men should be free. That's what I find hard.
20 years earlier, another civilian plane, this time a Cuban airliner, was blown up, killing all 73 on board. Cuba says this case highlights US hypocrisy on terrorism because these 2 well-known anti-Castro militants, Orlando Bosch and Luis Posada Carriles, are both living freely in Miami, though Cuba calls them the masterminds of the attack. Even Maggie is concerned by that contradiction.
I personally think that anybody anywhere in the world who attacks an armed civilian aircraft over international waters is a terrorist and should be punished for that. I don't care whether they're, from the right or the left of us or the center. This is a matter of human rights. It's not a matter of politics. And unfortunately, politics permeates everything.
Domestic politics certainly influences American foreign policy towards Cuba.